Somehow we have captured something of the New Testament call to love, but have we really captured the New Testament concern for truth and the importance of it, and a fidelity to the gospel?
Both Jesus and the Apostle Paul use strong language against those who would pervert and distort the gospel. Attacks upon the gospel have been present in every age of church history, so we must always be diligent, proclaiming the truth with clarity and without compromise. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Renewing Your Mind, as R.C. Sproul reminds us of this reality as he continues his examination of Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia. Galatians makes it clear that we cannot add to the saving work of Christ. You can study Galatians in more detail when you request Dr. Sproul's hardcover commentary, along with digital access to this series and Pleasing God. Simply give a gift of any amount at renewingyourmind.org, and we'll send you the commentary and unlock access to those series in the free Ligonier app. But be quick, as this offer ends tomorrow. Well, here's Dr. Sproul on Paul's message to false prophets who add to the gospel.
We begin now with verse 6, where Paul moves into the body or the substance of the concern that he is dealing with here in the Galatian epistle. He moves into this almost abruptly in verse 6, where he says, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. What Paul expresses here very clearly is a personal sense of what we might call apostolic astonishment. The word that he uses here is a word that is charged with emotional feeling. I'm astonished. I'm amazed. The King James says, I marvel. It's interesting that the word that Paul uses here, the Greek verb, is the one that is most frequently used in the New Testament to describe people's reaction to the power of Christ as he does his miracles. If you recall throughout the gospel narratives, when Jesus performs a miracle such as raising Lazarus from the dead or changing the water into wine or whatever he does, inevitably the crowd, the reaction of the observers, the spectators and the participants in this event is, we are told by the gospel writers, is that the people were astonished. This is not just a mild description. They're not just a little bit puzzled, you see. They are overwhelmed in a sense of astonishment, and this is the kind of word that Paul is using here. I'm astonished that you are so quickly removed, see, from him who has called you. Now, again, this always seems a little bit incongruous to me that Paul would be so astonished about anything that involves the sinful disposition of man. Because if there's anybody who presents for us in the New Testament a clear understanding of the propensity of man to move away from God, and who understands that our hearts are basically disinclined towards the things of God, it's the Apostle Paul. Paul perhaps understood better than any other Christian in the history of the world the depravity of the human heart. And you would think that this kind of behavior on the part of the Galatians, even those who were Christians, would not astonish him in the slightest, but would just only be consistent with this understanding of the instability of the human heart over against the things of God. So what I'm saying is that for Paul to be astonished means to me that these people, in their defection from Christ, had moved so rapidly and had fallen so seriously to evoke such a reaction from the apostle. Really means that we're involved here with serious business. This is no minor controversy. This is no little intramural debate here. This is something that is touching the very heart of the gospel of Christ. Paul says, I marvel that you are so soon removed. The King James there, right? Removed. The word that again is translated here, that in the Greek atmosphere, the context of the environment in which it is used, is the word that is usually used to describe a traitor. One who totally turns around in his allegiance to his government. This is one of the ways it's used in the contemporary vocabulary. Or it may be a rapid shift in political allegiance. In other words, the basic meaning of the word is to change allegiance. It involves a defection, a kind of treason that Paul has in mind here. And obviously, he's not happy about this. Now, I need to preface the rest of the comments that Paul uses because we're going to right away, very quickly in the body of this epistle, come face to face with some very harsh language that the apostle uses. That sometimes we would read this and think that it may even be inconsistent with this whole spirit of gentleness that the Christian is called to manifest and display, this attitude of loving, compassionate concern for the flock that a pastor is called to display. And yet here Paul is using this very harsh language here. I think that we need to be careful, however, when we read this, that we will see that basically this harsh language is not directed against the people, not directed against the flock. It's directed, you see, against those who are troubling the flock, against those who are seeking to undermine the gospel, those who are the enemies of the church. In a word, those who are the false prophets. And a further distinction may be made, and that is that Paul saves his wrathful vocabulary and his angry expressions for those who are corrupting the faith, not from the outside of the church, but those who are corrupting it from the inside of the church. If you look at the New Testament, you will see that this is consistent with the behavior of Jesus. Jesus doesn't go and use his biting criticism and his angry words of indignation on the people, on the children of Israel. Even though they have been caught up in following after error and they have been slow to see and understand the manifestation of the Son of God, Jesus is gentle with them. He's very patient and long-suffering with the prostitute, with the publican, with those people in the rank and file of Israel, the Amharetz, that are the people of the land. Jesus is very patient and kind and merciful. Jesus doesn't enter into a heated dispute with the enemies, the pagans on the outside of the church. But where do the hot, indignant words of Jesus, where are they directed in the New Testament? To the Pharisees, to the Sadducees, to the priests and the prophets of the church, to those who are inside the covenant community, who are distorting the truth. At that point, you see, there is no peace. There is not this sense of abiding, patient, tolerant understanding. No. For that, because there's a sense in which Jesus understood, there's a sense in which Paul understood, that the greatest threat to the people is not the threat from outside, but it's the threat from inside. Again, if you go back into the 16th century and you read the writings of Calvin, for example, and of Luther, on the other hand, sometimes these men are caricatured as just simply being angry men, because sometimes sarcasm and indignation virtually drip from their pen as they engage in debate, as they engage in controversy with the enemies of the faith. Notice that when Calvin calls people dogs and with Luther calls them devils, he's not talking about the people in the church. He's not attacking the pagan philosophers like that. But it's the false teachers within the church that become the object of their wrath and of their indignation. Luther himself has to confront his own personality and his own propensity for this kind of indignation when he's writing his commentary on Galatians. And I think he saw a little bit of his own personality emerging in the Apostle Paul when he's writing, and he explains his own position here. And he said, I feel that I should come to the people of the church with nothing but gentleness, nothing but patience, nothing but tolerance. He said, long-suffering with them, he said. But at the same time, I don't think, says Luther, that we should be quite so patient and gentle and tolerant with those people inside who are seeking to lead these people into such serious error that jeopardizes their eternal salvation. And he makes this analogy. He says, when a child goes outside and he gets involved with a dog that's a wild dog, and maybe the child shouldn't have been there. Maybe the child, you see, should have known better than to be in confrontation with this wild and vicious dog. And the dog bites the child. What does the parent do? He doesn't scream and holler and carry on a harangue with the child, but rather he takes the child. He loves the child. He nurtures the child. He tries to comfort the child in the midst of its pain, in the midst of its injury. But the parent obviously has nothing but anger and wrath and scorn and punishment for the dog, and he seeks to chase that dog as far from the house as possible. So I think that's an important thing to understand. Because what the problem we're dealing with here in Galatians is the problem really of the false prophet. And I have to say, if you look at the history of Israel in the Old Testament, the history of Israel's ups and the history of Israel's downs, the history of Israel's greatness, the history of Israel's shame, the history of Israel's election, the history of Israel's defection. All of that, you see, comes through the history of the Old Testament. And we see that Israel will prosper mightily as a nation, politically and militarily and economically for a time. And then the next thing you know, they're in bondage, they're in exile, they're being suppressed by a neighboring nation. And as you read through the Old Testament, you get an abiding sense of the impending danger that always exists at the borders of Israel. From her inception, she's vulnerable to attack by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Philistines and the Amalekites and the stalagmites and the stalactites and all the rest there that are always ready to pounce upon Israel and devour her. And, we get some glimpse of this kind of sense of instability, political instability, and constant sense of clear and present danger that threatens our national borders. You see it today, where Israel, the new Israel, that is the new nation of Israel, the state of Israel, lives in a day-to-day, moment-by-moment state of precarious existence surrounded by her enemies. Israel from time immemorial, constantly exposed and threatened from without. Yet if you read the Old Testament carefully, you will see that the cause of Israel's downfall, time and time and time again, is not the military power. It's not the military invasion from the outside, but the greatest threat to Israel's security always comes from within. The threat of the false prophet. The one who leads the people of Israel into a false sense of security, who leads them to be at ease in Zion in the context of their sin. The ones who were killed first in Israel are the true prophets. And this is what this first chapter is about, the debate between the true prophet, the true apostle, and the false prophet. And I'm going to expand a little bit later on what some of those basic differences are. But if you're familiar with Mendelssohn's Elijah, and you hear the passion cry of Elijah in that piece of music, where Elijah cries out, now let it end. Let me out of this. I've had enough. It was the lament of I alone am left. Release me, God, from my responsibility. He has this profound sense of standing alone. But he goes on and he begins to talk about the people had torn down the altars and broken the covenant and slain all of the prophets. That's the history of Israel. It's the history of prophet killing, of covenant breaking, of altar desecration. In the meantime, the prosperity goes to the false prophet, who tells the people what they want to hear. That's the basic characteristic of the false prophet. He tells the people what they want to hear. And as the prophet Jeremiah said, these people have itchy ears. And the false prophet capitalizes. He comes in and tells them, as it were, peace, peace, and there is no peace. Jeremiah's lament over and over and over again, almost like a refrain that he says in the Old Testament. He said, these prophets who come in crying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. He says, they heal the wound of the daughter of Zion slightly. That's the sarcasm that comes from them. You see, people want the cheap means of grace. They want the cheap healing. They want that which requires the least effort, the least amount of repentance, the least amount of fidelity to the truth, the least amount of discipline and obedience to Christ and to God. And the false prophet comes along and says, relax. You don't have to give your life to Christ. You don't have to repent of your sin. You don't have to pummel your body to subdue it every day. You don't have to live a life of relentless pursuit of obedience. No. The salvation comes very simply. In this case, be circumcised, maintain the externals of the law, you're in. What I'm trying to say is that you can't understand the strength of Paul's attack of these false prophets apart from some knowledge of that history. Paul was a Jew, and he was a Jewish scholar. He knew the history of his people. He loved his people. He so much loved his people, Israel, that even though he was called to be an apostle specifically to the Gentiles, that later, in his epistle to Romans, in the 9th chapter, he cries out, well, he would that he himself, he said, would be accursed from God if it would mean the salvation of Israel. The prophet who loves his people, he really loves his people. The pastor who loves his people, really loves his people. The parent who loves his child and really loves his child will not always tell them what they want to hear. Now, Paul is upset when he writes this epistle. But what I'm trying to communicate to you here is that this agony that Paul is going through, this disturbing of his own spirit that manifests itself in very harsh language from time to time, is the kind of agony that comes out of a profound love for these people in Galatia. I marvel that you're so soon removed from him who called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. Now that we have to comment. Oh boy, I haven't even covered one verse yet. But the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there were some that would trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. Notice that when the false prophet comes, he doesn't announce his message of saying, hear ye, I want you people to move away from the gospel and embrace my teaching, which is heresy. Now, he doesn't say that. He doesn't come along and say, let's get rid of the gospel altogether. But rather, the subtleties comes along, well, Paul got you off to a nice little start, but if we're really going to understand the truth of Christ, if we're going to have a real understanding of the gospel, then we need to go beyond this apostolic beginning. You see, no heretic in the history of the church has ever claimed to pervert the gospel. He might be saying that he's trying to bring it up to date. He may be talking about a new application or a supplement to it, that sort of thing. But no heretic has ever boldly declared that he was purposefully changing the gospel. Even Bultmann in the 20th century, who openly admits that the New Testament has to be radically demythologized if it's going to be applicable to our day, he still tries to isolate from that body of myth that which is abidingly the gospel. Now, Paul says, verse 7, which is not another. Okay? You see the irony here? What he's saying is that you think you're going to another gospel, another message of good news. There isn't any other gospel. There's only one gospel. There's no better gospel. There's no second gospel. In the technicalities here, the Greek words here is that Paul is talking about an other, that is a different gospel. On the one hand, the one word he uses suggested that there's no other gospel, no different gospel on the one hand, and the other word he uses there is the word that's translated another. In other words, in terms of a second gospel. There's no different gospel. There's no second gospel, that would even be the same. There's no other gospel except the gospel, the apostolic gospel, the gospel that finds its source in the mouth of Jesus himself. I'm laboring this point this morning because that is the issue of the 20th century. Is the church today committed to the gospel of Jesus, ergo the gospel of Paul? That's the issue, are we? Committed to that? Or have we sought by every means imaginable to relativize and historicize that gospel to render it harmless to modern man? Paul is saying there isn't any other gospel. And here's where he comes on strong in his language. Listen to this. Verse 8. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that you have received, let him be accursed. I don't think there's any place in the New Testament where more harsh and strong language comes from the pen of any apostle than we have right here. This is not a slap on the wrist. This is very, very serious. Notice what Paul says, if anybody gives you any other gospel than the one you've received, I don't care who it is. I don't care what their credentials are. I don't care if it's me, you see. If I should give you a different gospel than the one you had already, then let me be accursed. I don't care if it's a professor in the seminary. I don't care if it's a pastor in the pulpit. I don't care how much charisma he has. I don't care how many gifts of the Spirit he manifests. I don't care how many academic degrees come after his name, you see. I don't care if it's an angel from heaven. Let him be rebuked? No. Silenced? No. Accursed. The word that he uses here, notice this, is the word anathema, from which we get the English anathema. That's the strongest possible judgment that a person can make. In the Old Testament, the anathema was pronounced upon Jericho. In the conquest, you see, of Canaan, the cities were to be destroyed. The anathema of God was to come upon the pagan city in the destruction. Israel was not to preserve the walls of the city and incorporate it into their faith. The idea of God's making a clean sweep and starting with this separated people in a new community, untouched, unblemished by the influence of the present paganism. You see, this massive program that is carried out in the conquest of Canaan, so much to the fact that if Israel even saves the slightest bit of booty that would contaminate them, anyone who is caught doing that is to be executed, as was the case at Ai, who was responsible for the Battle of Ai. What's his name? Achan, who hid the booty under the tent. And so God inaugurated the idea that when you go in there, I want you to destroy that city and burn it to the ground, so annihilate it that it's impossible to ever rebuild it. Okay? Do away with any semblance of abiding value in that city. The word that is used there in the Septuagint is that God pronounces the anathema, the anathema on that city. It is to be reduced to rubble. Total destruction. And that's what Paul is saying. Let that happen to the person who comes and teaches you another gospel. In the Presbyterian church today, and in most any mainline church today, to depose a man from the ministry requires almost overt evidence that the man's committing adultery, physical adultery. Discipline is still visited to some degree in our church for those who commit these kind of gross and heinous sins of the flesh. Or if a minister would commit murder, he would be probably disrobed from his ordination status. If he were caught in grand theft, he would surely be rebuked and disciplined in any of the denominations that are represented. But let him preach another gospel, and no one raises a word about it. Let me just say that the severest punishment that we ever find in the Bible is that punishment directed not to the murderer or to the adulterer. That is not to suggest that those are tolerated or allowed or anything, but the severest punishment is reserved for the false prophet. They are the ones who come under the anathema of Christ. I say this so that you might have some understanding of this church of history. You wonder why it is when you go back to the Reformation that people are being burned at the stake for being heretics. We look at that as a primitive type of historical situation where we've moved out of with a greater sense of love and tolerance and patience and all the rest. Can we really say that? No, I'm not trying to reinstitute the business of the Inquisition or the rack or the stake. or a kind of witch hunt. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm remarking on is this, the astonishment with which we read these accounts of persecution and of punishment that were distributed at the time of the Reformation. You wonder, how could Christians get engaged in this? I'll tell you how they get engaged in it. They've understood something we don't understand, and that is teaching the people of God a gospel that is perverting the gospel of Christ is far more damaging to their well-being eternally than to rob them of their gold, or to rob them of their chastity, or to rob them even of their physical. Do you understand that? Somehow we have captured something of the New Testament called to love, but have we really captured the New Testament concern for truth and the importance of it, and a fidelity to the gospel? I can remember teaching at Gordon College a class of 250 students, and in this particular class we were dealing with the business of Christology and the question of Jesus' pre-existence and his eternal relationship with the Father. And I mentioned the fact that there were movements in history, going back through the councils of Nicaea and that sort of thing, dealing with the question of those who would deny the eternal existence of Christ. Some would argue that Jesus is not eternal, but that he's created. And some have reached a compromise. He's not just a man, but he's sort of the highest of the angels. He's the firstborn of creation, you see, where God creates Jesus first, and then Jesus creates everything else in the world. Now, this is what was going on back in the 4th century in those critical debates. But that issue, I pointed out, abides today in the sects of Jehovah's Witnesses and of Mormons. And particularly the Mormons have this idea that Jesus pre-exists the world, but he's not eternal. And they bring this doctrine as a corrective of classical Christian theology. And I was explaining to the class my reasons why this is not just supplementary to the Christian faith, but it's antithetical to the Christian faith and cannot be accepted as consistent with the gospel of Christ. And at the end of this little dialogue with the students, I said, all right, now, I've given you the case for the Orthodox view of the eternality of Christ and the biblical view of it. I've mentioned the Mormon view of it. And you recall, of course, that the authority by which Mormonism makes this change is their appeal to a new revelation that was received by Joseph Smith by the angel Moroni. Okay? Now, I dispute that. And I'm telling all of you people here in this room that what Joseph Smith says is wrong. And it's not only wrong, it's seriously wrong. Now I said to the student, I said, what would happen if, as I was standing up here talking to you right now, an angel, and you knew to be an angel, no doubt in your mind that it was an angel, that angel came in the door, the back of the room, and came up here and stood next to the platform, you see, glowing with this magnificent whiteness and heavenly glory all about it. And that angel spoke and said to you, please do not listen to your professor, for he is not telling you the truth. But really, what Joseph Smith has said is right. And I urge you people to believe it. I said, how many of you then would believe in Mormonism? If an angel came right in this room right now, and you knew to be an angel, and he told you that Mormonism was the truth, and what I'm saying to you is false, how many would you believe the angel? Every single hand in that room. I said, well, I'll tell you how obstinate I am. If an angel came in here and walked, floated through the air, performed miracle after miracle, I said, and came up here and told me that Mormonism was right, I would pick up that angel by the seat of his ethereal pants and boot him right through the window and tell him to go to hell where he came from. Yes. Because of the fact that even I can recognize that that message is not the same message that we get in the New Testament. Paul is saying that his authority, not my authority, but his authority, as an apostle, as an agent of revelation, cannot be gainsaid even by the angels from heaven. Christ has not commissioned the angels to be his messengers of the truth. Christ did not say of the angels, he who hears them hears me, and he who refuses to listen to them refuses to hear me. He did say that of his apostles. That's what's at stake right here. Do you grab that? Paul says, if we or an angel from heaven gave you any other gospel, which I give you, let him be anathema. Now, there's a different movement here now, and beginning in verse 10, Paul now moves into a defense of that authority that he's claiming, even over the ancients at this point. Or do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ. As a pastor and as a teacher, there's no verse probably in the New Testament that scares me more than this one. There's no rhetorical question before which I must tremble as much as I must tremble before this one. How do we answer that question? I hate to think of standing before the judgment seat of Christ and having the first question being raised to me from Jesus is, did you seek to please me? Or did you seek to please man? That's the struggle of the flesh every Christian pastor has to go through. You'd have to be a masochist to not want to please people. We are human beings. I do not enjoy to be an enemy with my people. No matter how much filled with the Holy Spirit I may ever become, I still have a great sense, an abiding sense of camaraderie with mankind. I am a man. I still belong more to the side of man than I do to God. Those are my peers, not the angels. And I sure don't want to have to isolate myself from the human community. Humanly speaking, do you understand that? Even Luther, who was able to stand so much up, confessed in his epistles how he struggled for the applause of men. Athanasius, who championed orthodoxy in the 4th century, when he died, was buried with this epitaph: Athanasius contra mundum. Athanasius against the world. Can you imagine what it cost a man? That man spent more time in exile than he did at home in the later years of his life. That's what it means to stand for the gospel of Christ. And every Christian pastor in America has to struggle with that dilemma. Let me just say, particularly those who are in Presbyterian-type government situations where the authority or the power rests with the people, where he knows that his abiding value as a pastor is only as strong as his ability to keep his position. You understand? There's a very certain sense in which those of us who are in that kind of a church are in a particularly vulnerable position. If you offend the people, you risk all the earthly security you have. Your stature, your financial security, all of those things are at stake when you step on the people's toes. Not only that, but we're aware of history of what has happened to those who have taken strong stands. I can remember, again, a personal illustration. I can remember at one point in my development, I had a zealous desire, the desire of the young Christian moving up. I said, God, I want you to make me not an able and competent scholar. What I want to be more than anything else is a great saint. I'll settle for nothing less than to be like Augustine, to be like Luther, to be like Calvin, to be like Edwards, to be like make me like one of those guys. That's what I want to be. Dr. Gerstner, in my formative years, made this statement once in a time of weeping at the contemporary situation of the church. He looked out at the church and what he saw, he said, Bob, we stand between Migdol and the sea. And we need a Moses that God will raise up, you see, who will lead us from that impasse of the threatening sea in front of us and the armies of Pharaohs behind us. That rang in my ears, and I said, oh, God, make me that man. Now my prayer is, God, we stand between Migdol and the sea. Please find somebody out there, who will be that man. I don't make prayers like that for myself anymore. And the reason is I read the biographies of those guys, like Augustine and like Luther and Calvin. And then my prayer became more like Augustine's earlier prayer, oh, God, make me a saint, but not now. I don't want to have to go through what those guys went. Either in the rigorous discipline that's necessary to be a saint in the first place, and in the second place, to take the obvious participation and baptism into the death of Christ that would necessarily involve. I don't want to pay that price. I don't want to offend people. I don't want to be in enmity with my brother man. The basic characteristic of the false prophet, remember, is that he's a pleaser of man. He tells the people what they want to hear. Paul is not suggesting that one who is faithful to the truth, one who is faithful to Christ, and who exercises duties as a pastor, as an evangelist, as a teacher, with all fidelity, is called upon to consciously, purposely, and determinedly offend people. Now, there are people like that who feel that it's their Christian duty to offend people, that they're not really being faithful to Christ unless they're jumping all over the feet of other people. You understand? I think you know the kind of personality I'm talking about. That's not what Paul's saying. Paul's talking about the kind of offense to people that will come if you are faithful to the truth. I want to say something that the contemporary minister, and those of you who have ministers who are trying to be godly men, they need your prayers, and they need your love, and they need your encouragement, even when they're speaking on your tongues. But the point that I think many people don't recognize is that in the Old Testament there was kind of a division of labor between the prophet and the priest. The priest's function was to be the one who speaks to God in behalf of the people. He was the one who was basically the minister of compassion, the minister of the anointing graces of God. You see, he's giving that to the people. He's ministering constantly to the people, and then interceding for the people, directing his attention to God, representing the people. The prophet's task, you see, becomes the spokesman of God to the people, and he primarily calls the people to repentance. But these two offices were not tied up in the same person, were they? The priest was the one who abided with the congregation. He had to live with these people day in and day out. The prophet, in a sense, he could run in and out of town and go up and live in the mountains for a few weeks, and then next week come out of the desert. You know, people say that the desert is a traditional location of the prophet in the Old Testament because it was there that God spoke to the prophet. Well, sure, that's true, but I think there's another dimension to that. I think there's another reason why the prophet spent a lot of time in the desert. It's the only place they were safe. See? And these guys had to continually get out of the community or they get killed. And they ended up being killed anyway. Where they didn't have the problem of having to live daily with the people that they were speaking to prophetically. But the minister today, you see, in the New Covenant, is called to be a combination of both priest and prophet. Makes his task even more difficult than the Old Testament prophet at this human level. Can you really be a prophet and a priest at the same time? And that's the question that goes through my mind, or went through my mind constantly as a pastor. However, there's a little irony here. I've discovered that if the people know that you are their priest, they are more likely to accept your prophetic message. And this you find in Paul. Paul was a priest to his people, and they knew it. And so they could hear the prophetic criticism that he made. Understand that? So what I'm saying is that there's a certain sense in which being a prophet and a priest at the same time makes the prophetic ministry more difficult because of you having to keep living with people. On the second case, there is a sense in which it makes it more easy because you can show the other side. You have that opportunity. But I'm afraid that so many times what we get caught up into in the ministry is spending so much of our time building up the image of the priest that we never get to the work of prophecy. That's the danger. And God knows our church needs the voice of the prophet today. Do I now persuade men or gods? Do I seek to please men? For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ. Paul's not despising men. He's not despising the relationship. Again, when he characterizes his own M.O. as an apostle earlier, so I didn't come to you with great rhetoric and eloquent speech and all that, but I came to you in the power and the demonstration of the Spirit. And then he goes on to say, and I was with you in your suffering. He entered into their suffering. There was a sense in which Paul identified with his people, and they knew that. He wasn't disparaging the people. He loved the people. But when it came down to the moment of conflict, you could depend on the fact that Paul, if there was a division between the people and of God, they knew where Paul was going to stand. He was going to stand with the side of Christ. Because he was first a servant of Christ, and secondly, a servant of his people.
And don't we each want to be known as servants of Christ too, not pleasers of men? You're listening to the Thursday edition of Renewing Your Mind. I'm your host, Nathan W. Bingham. You can hear R.C. Sproul's passion for the gospel in today's message, and this passion to proclaim and defend the gospel that is by faith alone was evident throughout his entire ministry. I count it such a blessing that my family was able to call him our pastor and sit under his preaching for almost 6 years. And each week he faithfully proclaimed the Word of God and the gospel. His preaching and teaching ministry formed the foundation of his expositional commentaries. And until tomorrow, you can request his commentary on Galatians when you give a donation of any amount at renewingyourmind.org, or when you call us at 800-435-4343. When you do, we'll also give you lifetime digital access to his series on Galatians and his series titled Pleasing God. So visit renewingyourmind.org or click the link in the podcast show notes before this offer ends. Why was Paul so bold in his defense of the gospel? Where did his authority to be so bold come from? That's tomorrow, here on Renewing Your Mind.